Welcome back to Suffocating in Suburbia. I am Stevie GB. Today is another solo episode, just me, and today I'm going to talk about comedy, stand up comedy specifically. I'm going to go over the top 10 list. This was hard for me because I really have like top 30, but I went down to 10, the ones that really have inspired me over the years, and the ones that I could watch over and over and over again and not feel like I'm tired of them. So these are my 10 all time top favorite comedians. Now, I don't have Groucho Marx on the list, which is probably a surprise to some people, but I tried to leave out the comedic film folks, Woody Allen, Groucho Marx, and even Larry David to a certain extent, even though they did do stand up, all of them. Oh, Groucho didn't really do stand up. He sort of did in the movies. I think for me, this is about their stand up comedy performances as a solo act on stage. And these are my favorites. I'm going to go through them one by one and give you a reason why they're on the list, top 10. And it was tough to put them in order, but I think I got it. And the top three or four were easy. After that, it was hard to figure out where they go. Number 10. Number 10 is Lenny Bruce. Now, Lenny Bruce is interesting because if I listen to his albums, and I did, they're not really stand up comedy. This is the 50s and the early 60s, very early 60s. And he was a real pioneer of what he did. He was kind of like the Woody Guthrie to Bob Dylan. Lenny Bruce is kind of like the Lenny Bruce to your Carlins and your Bill Hicks, because he was the real challenger of society. To me, Lenny Bruce epitomized what it is to be a stand-up comedian, what a comedian really is, holding up a mirror to society and not only poking fun at it, but creating the analogies that were so on point. And he was very self aware. He knew what he was. It was very personal to him. And if you listen to his albums, some of them are not even funny, but at the time they were shocking for the wrong reasons. And he was saying things that people were afraid to say in public. And that is really what stand up comedians are all about. Now, I'm no fear, no fear. Lenny Bruce was fearless. He was challenging. He was brilliant. Sometimes unlistenable, but that's okay. That's okay. If you listen to his stuff, you'll know what I mean. But number 10 on the list, Lenny Bruce. Lenny Bruce. Number 9, Richard Pryor. Now, again, like Lenny Bruce, challenging, saying things that needed to be said. I found him very funny when I was younger. As I got older, I found him very disturbing because what he was saying was just so raw, and he brought us into his life, and it was really hard to listen to, but so poignant. And again, self aware. He knew who he was. He was tortured, and he was the meaning of like why comedy is about tragedy. Richard Pryor was tragic. If you took his material out of context, it was sad and tragic, but somehow you laughed. And you weren't supposed to, but you did. So he was like a Jimi Hendrix of comedy, in that reinvented he reinvented the genre that was stand-up comedy, and he brought us into a world that we knew nothing about. Really genius stuff. Number 8, Bill Hicks. Again, Bill Hicks, sort of a Lenny Bruce kind of guy, but challenged all of us, brought us into situations, very personal, talked about drugs, talked about politics, talked about situations that he was in, and he did it in an extremely intelligent, highly intelligent way. Bill Hicks, when you listen to him, you realize how smart he is and how smart stand up comedy is. So he kind of brought it to an intellectual level. And really, very few have been able to match what Bill Hicks was able to do in his short time. And really, really genius stuff. Number 7, Colin Quinn. Now, this may be surprising to some of you because you think of him Saturday Night Live, tough crowd, kind of that gruff Brooklyn way of talking, Colin Quinn. But if you watch his one-man shows, and he's got 3 of them, they are absolutely brilliant. Colin Quinn is a brilliant storyteller. He's a brilliant comedian. He knows how to structure a joke and create a story and bring you in and give you a history lesson in layman's terms. I don't think anybody does it as well as he does. I think he's brilliant. New York Story, I've watched it probably 10 times, and I can relate. He knows how to connect with his audience. Colin Quinn, genius, genius, genius. Number 6, Jerry Seinfeld. Now, Seinfeld gets a lot of heat for being hacky. He attacks hacky subjects. But you know what? I don't buy it. Seinfeld is, to me, is a technician. He's a technician of comedy. This guy knows how to construct a joke. Every word is important in a Seinfeld joke. You could tell he works on it. He's talking about things that are so obvious, but in the way he does it, he has his own way. Even though you don't know much about him, it's not that personal story like the Lenny Bruce and Richard Pryor and Bill Hicks and even Colin Quinn. He's a joke teller, but he does it in a way that is just, he makes me laugh. He just makes me laugh. I don't have to sit there and analyze his comedy. I don't have to think too hard. Some people may call him mainstream. I don't. I think he's brilliant in his own way. I appreciate him. I love him. He's probably the most mainstream guy on my list, but that's okay. 876. Number 5. I have to look at my list. Number 5, Rodney Dangerfield. Nobody makes me laugh harder than Rodney Dangerfield. That guy, the one-liners, every single joke lands. When you watch a Rodney video, every single joke lands. They're all funny. I don't think I've ever seen him bomb. I mean, I'm sure he did. I'm sure he did. I've never seen it. But those old clips of the Carson show and every clip I've ever seen of Rodney Dangerfield has been one brilliant joke after another. And again, I don't know that much about him. I mean, maybe there's some biographical information in his jokes. It could be, it could not. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. He was a one-line machine. The guy was a machine, and perfect timing, delivery, material. Very few one-liner. I can't even think of anybody better than Rodney in that type of comedy, and he belongs on my list without a doubt. Okay, number 4. I got a female in there. Can you guess which one it is? Joan Rivers. Joan Rivers. Absolutely brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. Again, like a Lenny Bruce saying what needed to be said, biographical to a self-deprecating, strong, powerful, unbelievable tour de force of stand-up comedy. I've seen her live. She blew Don Rickles off the stage. I mean, she was so much better than him, and I love Rickles too. But Joan Rivers, to me, was the greatest female comedian, and I hate to use a gender because it doesn't matter in this case, one of the greatest comedians of all time ever, hands down, love her. Number 3 is a personal favorite, and again, some people don't find his brand of humor that funny, but he broke the mold, Steve Martin. What I loved about Steve Martin is, first of all, my parents didn't get it. He was the first comic that my parents watched, and they loved to watch the comedians, and they said, I don't get it. This guy's not telling any jokes. And that was exactly the point. Steve Martin figured out how to be funny without telling a single punchline. He was all character. He was all delivery. He was all show. A full entertainment tour de force. Nobody better. I just love him. I love his writing, his style. He went on to movies and books. Huge fan. Huge, huge, huge fan of Steve Martin. Number 2 on my list is a guy I grew up with, and I know now you're not even allowed to mention his name. I'm able to separate it. I think you know who I'm talking about. Bill Cosby. Greatest storytelling comic in the history of comedy. I grew up with Bill Cosby, listened to my brother Russell, who I slept with, one of the greatest comedy routines ever made. His albums were historic, they were brilliant. He did more for the black community than any other comedian. Even Dave Chappelle has recognized this. Bill Cosby was a flat out genius in storytelling and comedy. Nobody constructed a story better than Bill Cosby. And even though you saw the punchline coming, you didn't care. This guy, when he talked about Junior Barnes in the piece called Revenge, I don't remember the album. It was like on his Best of Bill Cosby. That was the one I mainlined. I love that album. He was sitting on the curb next to Junior Barnes. You were sitting right next to him. This guy brought you into his stories with every word and every motion. He talked it out. You were there the whole way. And even though you knew what was going to happen, you laughed. And there wasn't a lot of surprises in his humor. You knew what was coming. And even down to his last special, he had brilliant observations about life, about marriage and kids and growing up on the streets. The guy, nobody did it better than Bill Cosby and his brand of comedy. That brings me to number 1. Have you guessed it yet? Number 1, greatest comedian of all time in my book. Now, I've gone full circle. I went from Lenny Bruce, and if it wasn't for Lenny Bruce, we wouldn't have George Carlin. George Carlin is the greatest comedian that ever lived in my book. I don't know how many people could even argue that George Carlin isn't the greatest. Some people put Pryor at the top. That's fine. You can argue that with me. I understand it. He belongs in my top 10. He belongs in your top 10. We can interchange any of these guys or gals. You could put Joan Rivers at the top. I wouldn't have a problem with that. Listen to me. George Carlin, the best comedian that ever lived. I can't tell you how many times I've listened to the Class Clown album. I know every single word. In high school, I listened to that album. I memorized it. I went to school next day and I would recite it word for word, and so did my friends. This guy brought comedy to a level that had never been brought to. He took Lenny Bruce to the 30th power. That's what I think George Carlin did. And it's okay to be influenced by Lenny Bruce. It's okay. Bob Dylan was influenced by Woody Guthrie. George Carlin was influenced by Lenny Bruce. That's the lineage. That's the lineage. And it's perfectly fine. George Carlin, number 1 greatest comedian of all time. That's my list. That's my list. Now, there were other ones I could have included. I struggled with Andy Kaufman. I love Andy Kaufman. I struggled with Rickles, Bob Newhart, Alan King. These were all great comedians that I love and adore and could listen to over and over. I even left out some of today's comics, Bill Burr, Louis C.K., and yes, Sebastian Maniscalco. I know a lot of people hate him because he's mainstream. Sebastian Maniscalco is like a mixture. He's a hodgepodge. He's Bobby Collins and Andrew Dice Clay and Jerry Seinfeld rolled into one. He's like I don't know, he's like the Eagles of comedy. It's like mainstream comedy. He's like the greatest hits guy. And that's okay. He's funny. I laugh. I sit back. I relax. I don't analyze. He's not in my top 10, but the guy is funny. People love him. And that's fine too. As long as you're laughing, you're happy, it's working. But to me, these were my top 10. Lenny Bruce, Richard Pryor, Bill Hicks, Colin Quinn, Jerry Seinfeld, Rodney Dangerfield, Joan Rivers, Steve Martin, Bill Cosby, George Carlin. That's my top 10 of comedy. I hope you enjoyed this episode. See you next time.